quite literally scared, not just that we would be kicked and punched, which was happening all the time.
How could the Beatles, the most beloved band in the world, go from global icons to targets of rage in a foreign country? What began as a misunderstanding during their 1966 trip to the Philippines quickly exploded into chaos, angry mobs, death threats, and a frantic escape. How did the situation escalate so far? And why were the Beatles' lives suddenly in danger? In July 1966, the Beatles arrived in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, as part of their ambitious world tour. By that time, they were undeniably the biggest band on the planet. Every stop on their tour was a spectacle, with tens of thousands of screaming fans lining up to see the Fab Four. But behind the glitz and glamour, the band was already feeling the toll of life on the road. The tour itself was riddled with difficulties even before they reached the Philippines. Tensions among the Beatles and their management were growing, spurred on by relentless travel, relentless press obligations, and a grueling schedule. John Lennon publicly expressed his frustration, saying, "We were always half dead. They treated us like monkeys in a zoo." But nothing prepared the band for the chaos they would face in Manila. Their arrival in the Philippines was met with scenes of utter bedlam. Crowds of adoring fans swarmed the band's motorcade, and local newspapers hailed their visit as a monumental event. However, underneath the surface, political dynamics were brewing. Unknown to them, they had unwittingly entered a country where the ruling family, led by President Ferdinand Marcos and First Lady Imelda Marcos, demanded extreme loyalty and deference. By this time, Imelda Marcos had cultivated her image as the mother of the nation, and her every public gesture was met with unwavering support. Declining an invitation from her was more than just an act of rudeness. In the eyes of the Filipino people, it was tantamount to disrespecting the entire nation. The Beatles were oblivious to this cultural and political undercurrent. Their manager, Brian Epstein, handled all their diplomatic and logistical matters, making decisions with efficiency, not tradition, in mind. Unbeknownst to the band, he declined a formal invitation for them to attend a private lunch at the presidential palace, setting the stage for the disastrous events that would soon unfold. What began as a simple scheduling issue spiraled into a series of events that left the Beatles fearing for their lives. After Brian Epstein's polite refusal of Imelda Marcos's invitation, the band members were completely unaware of the cultural significance of their absence. However, as word of the snub spread, the situation escalated far beyond their comprehension. The backlash began swiftly. Filipino television broadcast the perceived insult repeatedly, framing the Beatles as disrespectful and ungrateful. Front-page headlines decried their lack of manners, with phrases such as "the Beatles turn their backs on Malacanang" and "first family shamed by foreign celebrities," to name a few. The Marcos-controlled media used the incident to stoke public outrage, and what might have been seen as a minor faux pas elsewhere became a full-blown national scandal. At this point, the Beatles team was caught off guard. The band members themselves were confused and insulated from the growing animosity outside their hotel. In his later interviews, George Harrison reflected, "We couldn't understand why everything was so tense. Nobody told us what was happening." The situation took a darker turn the following day when their concert promoters and hotel staff abruptly abandoned them. The usual organized fanfare that accompanied their experiences in other countries was replaced by eerie silence. Local security forces, who were initially tasked with protecting them, were nowhere to be found. As they attempted to leave their hotel for the airport, chaos erupted. The streets outside were lined with angry mobs, not fans, but civilians enraged by the supposed slight toward their country. These crowds began hurling insults, pushing and throwing debris as the Beatles and their entourage tried to make their way to their vehicles. With no police support to control the crowds, the hostility intensified. Members of their road crew were jostled and beaten by the mob, and equipment was stolen in the madness. According to Tony Barrow, their press officer at the time, It wasn't just about shoving, it was actual physical violence. There was real danger in the air. As they reached the airport, the situation barely improved. Once inside, airport staff deliberately made the band's exit as difficult as possible, ignoring protocol and denying them customary assistance. They were surrounded by hostile officials, and Brian Epstein was forced to surrender thousands of pesos, a thinly veiled bribe, just to allow them passage. All the while, angry locals continued to gather outside, shouting and banging on windows. For the Beatles, the magnitude of the danger was becoming terrifyingly clear. Paul McCartney later described the incident, saying, "We just looked at each other and thought, this could be it. We may not get out of here alive." What should have been a simple departure turned into a desperate struggle to get on their flight unscathed. The band's carefree charm, which had endeared them to millions worldwide, offered no protection against the escalating fury in Manila. For the first time in their illustrious career, the Beatles found themselves in a situation where their fame was not a shield, but a target. The chaos at the airport was only the beginning. As the Beatles waited to board their plane, the tension reached its peak. The staff, under apparent pressure from the Marcos regime, delayed their boarding process as throngs of people gathered outside the terminal. Officials demanded that additional paperwork be signed, and Epstein struggled to navigate the confusing bureaucracy. It became increasingly clear that every step toward leaving the Philippines was being deliberately obstructed. During this time, the Beatles and their entourage were harassed and humiliated. Members of their crew described being shoved by airport employees and subjected to jeering remarks. Mal Evans, the Beatles' loyal road manager, reportedly tried to shield Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr as the situation became physically threatening. As George Harrison later recounted, "They were trying to make as much trouble for us as they could. We were all stunned by it." The true scale of the hostility became evident when it was revealed that local officials had even considered holding the Beatles until a formal apology was issued directly to the Marcos family. According to press officer Tony Barrow, the band was told by their local handlers, "Either you comply with the government's wishes, or you may not leave at all." The mob outside the terminal, initially kept at bay by glass windows, began to push harder as the delays continued. While the Beatles managed to stay relatively safe inside the airport, their crew wasn't as fortunate. Members of their team were violently punched, kicked, and spat upon as they scrambled to protect what little equipment they still had. Neil Aspinall, a key member of their management team, was heard shouting over the commotion, "Just get us out of here alive!" Financial extortion only made matters worse. High-ranking officials demanded exorbitant additional fees for safe passage out of the country, effectively holding the band hostage. Epstein reluctantly paid sums of cash that he believed were bribes just to ensure their exit. There was no certainty the plane would even take off, as rumors swirled that air traffic controllers loyal to the Marcos regime might interfere with the flight schedule. When the Beatles finally boarded the plane, they found no relief. The tension on board was unbearable, with many fearing last-minute retaliation by local authorities. "It was the first and only time we thought we might not make it home," Ringo Starr later said. The bandmates sat in silence for most of the flight, visibly shaken by the ordeal and carrying the mental scars of what had unfolded. For the first time since their meteoric rise, fame and charm had failed them. The escapade in Manila wasn't just a personal nightmare, it was a harrowing lesson in the volatile intersection of politics, culture, and celebrity. What had begun as a miscommunication exploded into an almost unimaginable example of hostility toward the world's most famous musicians. Once safely out of the Philippines, the Beatles and their entourage began to process the events that had just transpired. For the band members, the Manila ordeal left a deep and lasting impression, one that went beyond the physical danger. The experience marked a breaking point not only for their endurance as touring musicians, but also for their perception of fame and its power, or lack thereof, in certain situations. As they landed in New Delhi on the next stop of their tour, they issued no public statements, choosing instead to remain silent about the events in Manila for fear of further escalation. Behind closed doors, however, the mood within the group was somber and tense. It was clear that the experience had unsettled them deeply. George Harrison reflected later, "After being in the Philippines, I wouldn't ever go back there, not even if you paid me." The tension between the band and Brian Epstein also began to grow in the aftermath of the incident. While Epstein had done his best to protect the band and navigate the hostile environment, his decision to refuse Imelda Marcos's invitation was increasingly scrutinized. Some members of the entourage blamed the situation on Epstein's lack of understanding of local customs and the political climate. Paul McCartney remarked years later, "We had no idea about all these formalities. We just felt like we were put in the middle of something that wasn't our fault." Financially, the tour's stop in the Philippines was a disaster. The band had been forced to abandon most of their equipment due to the chaos at the airport, and the extortionate payments made to officials meant they left the country at a significant loss. Furthermore, the negative press coverage in local Filipino media ensured they would not be welcomed back in the foreseeable future. With their reputation in the Philippines tarnished and their safety nearly compromised, the incident became one of the darkest chapters in Beatles history. On a broader scale, the Manila incident also contributed to the band's decision to retire from touring entirely. The constant pressure, logistical nightmares, and increasingly dangerous situations like this one made it clear that live performances were no longer sustainable. Just weeks after the Philippine debacle, the Beatles played what would become their final live concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29, 1966. Reflecting on the tour as a whole, John Lennon said, "We were fed up of being beaten up. It wasn't fun anymore." The incident also served as a stark reminder of how fame could quickly turn into a liability. While the Beatles may have been untouchable icons in much of the Western world, in Manila they were vulnerable strangers caught in a volatile cultural and political landscape. It was a sobering reminder that their success did not guarantee immunity from danger when navigating unfamiliar territory. Decades later, the Manila incident continues to be a powerful anecdote of life at the peak of Beatlemania. It illustrated not only the extreme devotion they inspired, but also the darker side of international fame, a lesson the Beatles carried with them as they moved away from the stage and deeper into the studio.